All right. So I want to. When did Grandpa get into? Start from the beginning. When Grandpa started in aviation was when you were born, right?
Yes. Actually, let me go to the beginning. My father was born in 1908, Jose Antonio. He was born to a merchant family. They had a bakery in the town.
Okay.
My grandfather, his dad, was a hatter. He had a store that serviced hats. Those days, most men wore a hat in a town called Cauto Embarcadero. When my father was growing up, from 1908, one of the things that always had his interest was the fact that aviation was becoming the big news. You know, it was before, right around World War I, 1914 to 1918, and he was fascinated by seeing planes made of sticks and wire and fabric fly. So he used to make model planes in those days using small strips of wood and using tissue paper. My grandfather, his dad, was a very stern individual. He actually told him, he says, don't waste your time, make sure you just go to work in the family business, so on and so forth. But as the years went by, he started out with the business of repairing bicycles. A little bit of a history like the Wright brothers. He had a bicycle shop. Later on, he became a motorcycle shop. He became an avid motorcycle rider. He belonged to a club that they used to do stunts. And then, you know, that was a period between 1920 and the end of 1930s. Late in the 30s, with the beginning of World War II, he had a business that made shoe polishes. Most of his raw materials came from Germany, in Cuba, believe it or not. And with the outbreak of the war in Europe, my father could not get the materials. So he gave up on the raw materials, and he had it in his mind that the people in my hometown, which is an industrial with agribusinesses around, one of the main industries there was, for example, a plant built by Nestle Corporation out of Switzerland. There were no buses for the people to move about. They either had to walk, bicycle, or use horse-drawn carriages, which were used as taxis. It was a very long town because it was along a river, and my father came up with the idea of a bus, making a bus line. His first bus he created. He bought an old Mack truck, took the cabin apart. He just kept the chassis. With the chassis, he built a bus made out of wood and metal with the windows just to look like a regular bus with one minor detail. He couldn't get the headlights because, again, he was rationing because it was World War II.
Yeah.
So he looked around and he got an idea of taking a light from a retired railroad car, which had a single big line, light in front. And he used to call it, the people used to call it the Cyclops because it only had one eye.
It was the only bus in town.
And he was the only bus in town. It was it was a mild success because at the beginning, people refused to ride it. So he had to give him free rides for about six months, with my grandfather, the hatter, being the guy that was in charge of making sure people that got on board, explained to them that when the service started, he was going to allow them to save a lot of time going to work, especially to the dairy plant for nursery. So sure enough, people got on board. 1944, 43, even 45 early. He was doing well. He had about 3 or 4 buses at the time. Just to give you an idea, one bus in a day running from 5 o'clock in the morning until about midnight would actually go 800 kilometers, which is about 500 miles. So they would run a lot. But the idea of aviation stayed with him. So he decided to learn to fly. He picked up on a friend of his that actually was a pilot that used to do stunts for shows in small towns, taught him how to fly the basics. And then he ordered a plane, his first plane, a Piper Cub J3 from Lock Haven, Pennsylvania, right from William T. Piper, from the factory. The plane arrived in a box with the engine and everything, just like if you buy a model plane.
Yeah.
And he put it together from instructions. He had put the books. Most of the aviation books in Cuba at the time, those in Spanish, were actually made in Argentina. Argentina at the time had a fairly developed aviation industry. South America in particular, because of the distances. Brazil, Argentina, Colombia, so on and so forth. They were using mostly Fokker, tri-engine aircraft for transportation, and that was basically the way they got around. Some of them were actually they also brought the Ford tri-motor.
Yeah.
So my father bought the plane, brought it. In the meantime, he met my mother, 1944-45, and married her. I was born in 1945, at the end of the war, June 1945. And there are some pictures around the house where, as my father put the plane together, my father and my mother would put me in diapers sitting in the plane so people could get an idea of what the plane looked like, with pictures, no video, of course. So he got the plane put together, and it was the first civilian registered aircraft called CUN-1. CUN in Cuba means Cuban Normal, which meant that it was a Cuban commercial aircraft. Non-commercial, but non-passenger transport. He got his license. He first basically soloed himself. That meant that he learned the basic skills for what they call pilotage by himself, just by trying takes off and landing, short one, short hops. There was a big piece of land outside town that belonged to the county where we lived. And my father by that time had developed a lot of political connections. And he was able to get a 100-year lease on a piece of land and set up the first municipal airport in my hometown. He had one feature. It was very flat land, even though it was a dirt runway rather. It was 9 kilometers from the town. Nowadays, if you take a look at a Google map, the place where the runway used to be is actually surrounded by housing, and it's all populated. They destroyed the airport after the revolution. And when my father developed the airport, he developed an FBO, fixed base operation, and developed a following, even in not only in Cuba, but in the U.S., where there were people that used to fly light duty single engine aviation aircraft.
H-18s.
Yeah, H-18s, also twins, light twins. The beginnings of the Piper Aztecs, Piper Comanche, twin Comanches. They used to go for overhauls to my father's airport. At that point, besides being an operator of the airport, he developed an air taxi system for the area, for mostly the wealthy people that had dirt runways in their own farms up in the hills. My father did very well. The revolution started actually in 1953, but the real breakout of the revolution was in late 1957, 56 rather, and it was fought 57, 58. My father's airport had the ability that he had a very long runway, so my father, who had befriended Batista, the dictator at the time, when he was in motorcycles in the 1930s, talked to him and offered the airport, not free, he offered them for rent, to build a runway that was actually supportive of military aircraft, B-26s, C-46s, C-47s. There was even a couple of Thunderbolts, P-47s that the Cuban Air Force had. There was even 2, I think, Mustangs, P-51s from World War II. A lot of AT-6s that were converted, but there was a development that would remind you of what happened in Vietnam, where they started using lighter aircraft like Piper Cubs to be spotters
Yeah.
for the armed forces. And my father actually helped develop the system to put a 30 caliber machine gun on a rail, and the pilot would fly with somebody in the back seat and actually use the machine gun to fire from the plane sitting down. The other development was an interesting one, was taking a hand grenade, a pineapple,
Yeah.
and when you take the pin off, instead of just throwing it down, you would put it inside a glass container, glass jar, throw it, and when it hit the ground, that the glass jar would open, crack, the grenade would explode. So they became light bombers, so to speak. So the revolution started. The base was very functional. We had even a training ground for some of the military recruits. The revolution actually, while it was going on, charged my father with aiding the government to fight the rebels.
When did they start? When was the base active in what year?
56 to 57.
And the revolutionary
It
was?
started, no, the base started, the revolution, when the revolution started in December of 56, the first military plane that landed
Yeah.
with a colonel that came from a Marine detachment, Cuban Marines, actually landed in my father's airport. So my father right away made a deal and says, you can use a certain area of the airport to set it up as a base. They build billets, they build for places where the crews and the maintenance crews and the pilots could live in. And before you knew it, there was like about half a dozen planes all the time there, and a couple of tanks to protect the air base. A few times the rebels tried to attack it, but the place was so flat that if you had a plane flying, you could see them. And at one point, my brother, who was already a pilot at the time, was flying around in the Piper Cup that we owned, that we still kept it, even though at that time we owned the best plane we ever had, which was a Cessna 180, which my father also used as an air ambulance. They tried to actually shoot my brother down. So, but my brother didn't notice that they had been shooting at him.
Because it's a bad recovery aircraft.
Yeah, until he landed and he saw that there were a bunch of holes in some of the tail surfaces.
What were some of the planes that Grandpa owned?
He owned the Piper Cup, he owned Tri-Pacers, he owns Air Coupes, he owned Piper Cruisers, Super Cruisers. He owned Cessna 140, a 170, and finally the Cessna 180.
Did he own them all at the same time?
No, one at a time. He usually had never more than 2 planes, one for training, always a Piper Cup.
Yeah.
Because, for example, the Piper Cup that we had, CON1, had wooden spars, and it was really not meant for a trainer that could be abused because it was somewhat fragile. So eventually we got
Piper Cups were. So.
Yeah. So eventually we got Piper Cups like the J5s and the A18s and
The Super Cup.
the Super Cups that had bigger engines, not 65 horsepower anymore. And that's what my father used for the training school.
But he had a Super Cruiser also.
Yes, the Super Cruiser was interesting because most people don't realize that it was a plane that, even though it only carried 3 people, the passenger, the pilot, and 2 passengers, he had a very long range because it was meant to be a cruiser
Yeah.
for families, for a young family, husband, wife, and a child. And my father actually flew it to Mexico over water, flew it to Haiti, flew it to Jamaica, because he belonged also to a new club, which was a private pilot club. So, and my father also did acrobatics. He used the Piper Cup to do acrobatics. He organized air shows so people could see it. Remember, this town was a town in the middle of literally nowhere. So my father was a well-liked in town because he was somebody, an innovator. And when the airport was militarized, it was interesting for me in particular just to watch, to see the military aircraft come in and land. The revolution triumphed, January 1959, the government fled and Castro's government took over. Soon thereafter, they started nationalizing all businesses, which means it was nationalizing, no, it was actually stealing the businesses from private hands.
Hold on a second. Pause that.